Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're continuing our coverage of the second tournament in the 2019 Grand Prix. This one's in Latvia. 4 Grand Prix all year. Each player will end up playing in 3 of the tournaments. That's already predetermined. They know which ones they're going to play ahead of time. But in this particular tournament, we have 16 players. They're playing a knockout tournament. They play a best of 2. The winner of that's going to move on to the round of 8, which we are in right now in round 2. If you do not have a winner after 2 games, then you go to tiebreakers. And we are in tiebreakers today. Our competitors, white's going to be played by Krzysztof Duda. He's the #1 Polish Grandmaster. He's only 21 years old. Extremely young, talented player. Became a Grandmaster at the age of 15. If you have not seen him play, he is very, very strong. Playing the black pieces, Mamedyarov, one of the strongest players in the world right now. And they drew in the first tiebreaker. So this could be the deciding game in the tiebreaker. For those who didn't watch one of the earlier videos where we went over the structure, in the normal classical style, you get 90 minutes per game, and you get 30 extra minutes after move 40, and you get 30 seconds added on per move. In tiebreakers, you only get 25 minutes. If after 2 games there's no winner, then you start going into some faster games where you get 15 minutes and then it goes down from there. So we'll go ahead and get started with Jan. Starts with knight to f3, d5, c4, and then after pawn e6 we see b3. So this is the English opening, but then it starts getting into the Larson's opening with pawn b3. Not a common opening here from white, but one that my guess is Jan Krzysztof is pretty familiar with. Knight to f6, bishop b2, so fast fianchetto on the queen side of the board. Bishop e7, pawn e3, castle on the king side. Knight c3, we do see an exchange right here, so the bishop pair eyeing down the king side for black here. Pawn c5, and then rook g1. Was not expecting to see this as I was analyzing the game. A lot of different options here. Queen to c2 makes a lot of sense. Castle on the king side. That's an option if you want to stop your opponent. Pawn h3 is pretty common here. Blocking the knight to come down to g4. You have a good setup right here. You can control the center of the board. Pawn to d4 at some point. Castling just makes a ton of sense. But he has other plans, and he plays rook to g1. Shakir continues with a6, pawn g4. So if you're going to play rook to g1, you definitely got to start pushing on the king side of the board. Pawn b5, forcing the bishop to come back here, e2, bishop b7, fianchetto getting ready to attack the king side of the board here. Continue to push forward, g5, knight moves to the center of the board, queen to b1, trying to activate as much as possible. Could have also come to c2, did have some options there. Does not look like he's going to be castling his king here. Knight to d7, a knight up here, e4, queen c7. So great development move from Shakir, and he has a good setup. King side castle, all of his pieces are developed here. Now it comes down to, can he find a strong attack? From white's standpoint, he really has to push on the king side. There's no reason to have this setup unless you're going to have a strong attack. So if he can do that, he's going to have a good possibility of coming out with a victory. If he's not able to come up with a strong attack, I do believe black's going to be able to dominate this game. Rook to g4, pawn e5, just trying to control the center of the board a little bit. Some of these critical squares here on d4 and f4 as well. Pawn to a3 just blocks off some of the squares that the knight can come to. This is going to be tough for white to deal with, so does want to stop the knight coming there to b4. Now the rooks start getting involved. Rook to e8 from Shakir, queen to c2 from Jan. Bishop f8 wants to allow the rook to control the center of the board here. h4, which is what I think white should have been doing for a long time now, starting to attack on the king side of the board. Queen c6, and then d3. I think you got to continue with the play here. h5 makes a lot of sense. Starts to block off all these critical squares that black can go to. Yes, eventually you'd want to play pawn d3, play king to d2. Your king's in the center of the board, so you do want to open up for the rook to come over here, swing to the king side of the board. But right now, I don't think is the time. You got to start pushing here. He decides to go and play d3, pawn a5, and then pawn a4. And this is, I think, the first critical mistake that white has in the game. the pawn on a3 is exactly where it needs to be. As soon as it comes up here, he loses control of the b4 square, and that is a very critical square because the knight can come to b4, which is exactly what black does, attacking the queen right here. Queen to c3, queen e6, just centralizing. Now it's attacking both this pawn here on a b3 as well as the rook here on a g4. Knight comes back to d2, which is nice. It is playing double duty here. This pawn is now protected, and the light square bishop is now defending this rook here on g4. But that's not what you want your pieces doing. It's not defense mode from white here. Really should have been attacking on the king side of the board. Pawn takes on a4. We do see an exchange here, and then knight b6 attacking the pawn. We see the knight come up here to c4. Doesn't have to worry about that pawn since it took here. So since the bishop's still defending the rook, he can start to get this knight involved into the game. And he doesn't want to make the mistake of taking with his knight here. If he does, that's going to be bad. Bishop takes. If the queen were to take right here, then the queen can take the rook. If we see the bishop take, then knight to d3. And this is the main move here of why this does not work, because this is forking the queen after the king moves. Then the knight's going to come up here and take. So definitely look to have analyzed this in the game. You don't have a ton of time, but eventually you see that, yes, the knight did not move away from d7 to here without knowing that he could not take this pawn. So analyzed and realized, yeah, can't do that. Plays knight to c4 instead. We see the knight start to come off the board. Knight takes c4, pawn recaptures, rook to d8. We now have an open file here. Black immediately takes control of that with his rook. King f1, bishop c8. Now the bishop and the queen both attacking the rook here on g4. Decides to go ahead and bring his rook back. Does have protection here, but I guess he decided he just doesn't want that under fire. Bishop back to b7, now attacking the knight here in the center of the board. Pawn f3 supporting that, but it also just gives a little bit of air for black to start to come and even attack this king more than he already was here. Queen g6. You can see nothing has been done on the king side of the board from white. Because of that, and he didn't have a strong attack, he started out with that rook to g1 and immediately played g4. Didn't do much after that. He's now playing full defense. So the bishop and the queen both attacking the knight right here. Knight comes back, recognizing he only has one defender. So knight to f2. This is a purely defensive move. And then pawn h5. Just does not want to have to worry about any pawns pushing forward. This really stops many of the threats that white is thinking about later on in the game. Rook to g1 and then queen down c2. Getting pretty aggressive on the board. Bishop d1 attacking the queen. Queen comes back to f5. King g2. And this is, we've talked a lot, as soon as queens come off the board, we always say now's the time to get the king involved into the game. It's a very valuable piece. The queens are not off the board. Not the best time to get the king involved into the game. It didn't have a lot of protection already, but this is a pretty open board state for black to start to attack. Knight to d3, getting it involved. Bishop to e2 attacking, but that's fine. Pawn e4, starting to put a lot of pressure on his opponents here. Pawn f4, trying to have a solid pawn chain right here, but there's just no way to really stop stuff, and that starts with knight takes on f4. And this is check. No really good way to defend this. We do see Jan take with his pawn here, but then pawn e3 is the dagger. No way to come back from this. Attacking the knight right here, but it's also a discovered attack with the bishop. This is check, so we already know that one piece of material is going to fall. Can't retake with this queen here. Both of these rooks are completely dominating the center of the board. Bishop to f3, stopping the check. Bishop comes down. We do see an exchange right here. But then the pawn to f2, and at this point, the game is over. There's just no way to stop all of the threats. There's a lot of different threats that are being shown right here from black. The first one, the most obvious, is the pawn takes on g1. Okay, that's one of them. The second one is just going to be the rook coming down here to d3. That's both attacking the king and forking the queen right here. If the king takes, then all of a sudden you're going to have the queen come down, take, both the rooks get involved into the game. There's going to be no way to hold on to that. Lots of different variations that black has to checkmate. One of those may be rook to g2. One alternative to try to hold on to this material. But as we talked about, the rook comes down. There's just no way to hold on to this material. Could have an in-between move. Rook takes, or queen takes here on f4. Check. Eventually, the queen is going to fall. There's no way to stop this once your opponent has your queen. And they have a queen. They can just gobble up so much material. At the end of the day, Jan Krzysztof would have lost. But he decided to go ahead and resign after the pawn takes here on f2. So Shakir will be moving on to the semifinals. There are 4 left in this tournament. So congratulations to him. Hard-fought battle in the tiebreakers. Jan Krzysztof, young Polish Grandmaster, played extremely well, even to get to the 4th game in the heads-up match. So thank you guys so much for watching. We'll be back tomorrow in round 3 to see who can make it to the finals.